So I think we can get started. A couple of more people will slowly enter the room in the next minutes, but I think we can, just get rolling. So I'm Andreas Graaf. I'm program lead for EU climate and energy policy at Agora Energiewende. I've been with Agora since 2017, and now we've just entered this new premise upstairs in our new office. We had our office welcoming yesterday. It's also my pleasure to welcome you to this event, but mainly to serve as your MC, guiding you through the event. So briefly, this is a joint event being co-organized by Agora Industry, the Regulatory Assistance Project, RAP, and E3G on the topic of electrification of industry. So the program is relatively straightforward. We'll have some brief opening remarks by our Director EU at Agora Energiewende, Emmeline Speer, who I will introduce in a couple of seconds. We will have then 2 input presentations before going over to a great panel to discuss this important topic, and we'll wrap up with some closing remarks. Importantly, this is a hybrid event. For those in the room, that means please be mindful of the fact, the speakers, but also anyone present here who's asking questions, that online participants will only hear you if you are standing in front of a microphone. We should have microphones to pass around in the later question and answer session. And for those online, you will have an opportunity to interact with this event in the Q&A session following the panel. But with no further ado, let me briefly introduce you our new Director EU, Emmeline Speer, who has over 20 years of experience working in power system transformation. She has experience working for the French electricity market platform, the Belgian TSO Elia, as well as the French energy regulator CRE, before joining us here at Agora, and has been Director EU only for a couple of months now, since October, taking over from our previous EU Director, Matthias Buck. She will come up here now to say a few opening words to welcome you and to introduce the topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure also to welcome you to this event co-hosted with E3G and RAP. So yesterday, please come in, it's fine. So yesterday, on the panel of this other event that we had, I was asked, what is the single most important topic that deserves our attention in the coming years? And my answer was electrification, or my answer was rather 23%. We need to get the 23% share of electricity in final energy consumption moving. Of course, in the very short term, if we put ourselves in the shoes of industry leaders, there are a lot of possibly other issues that would come on top of the list, right? High pressure from highly competitive Chinese imports, protectionist impulses from the new president-elect of the US, and a lot of headlines about bankruptcies and jobs moving abroad. But it's important to keep also thinking long-term, to stick to the direction of travel. And we know, and I think if not, we will be even more convinced after today, that electrification is a key strategy for not only climate, but for resilience and for competitiveness in the long run of our continent. And it's important to stick to that, and to stick to that direction of travel, because investors need certainty and because infrastructure development requires certainty as well. And the earlier we move, the cheaper, the earlier the benefits and the cheaper the energy transition and the whole climate transition will be. So I'm glad to see, I think it's fair to say that we have seen the industry move in the past few months, and an increasing number of voices you know, saying that yes, electrification is the way to go. I think it was again the ceramics industry 2 days ago in the parliament. So we see this emerging consensus. And I'm glad also that I'm being told from time to time that the study that we're going to present here again today had its part in it. So now is the time to move, now is the time to act and to make progress. The study that we have done and we published in June identifies tremendous opportunities, also identifies barriers that we need to tackle. And we were calling in this study for an industry electrification action plan, and it's now actually planned, and we are very glad about that. Sorry, looking at my notes. So I'm looking forward to the discussions today. I'm looking forward to hearing from our panelists how we can make progress and how we can strike the right balance in the coming years between short-term and long-term, between supporting the industry but also giving electrification incentives, between lowering energy prices and making sure that we keep the right competitive edge for electricity versus fossil fuels. Thank you very much, and I give you back the floor, Andreas.
So yes, it's my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Marco Giuli, who is Project Manager for Climate Neutral Industry EU at Agora Industry and is leading our work on industry electrification at the European level. And I will let him say a few words, obviously. I think the presentation overall is relatively short, just to end before handing over to the second speaker. So overall, I think we have about 20 minutes planned for presentations.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So, as we have heard, electrification is an increasingly discussed pathways for industry decarbonization. So, a few months ago, we posed to ourselves the question, okay, but what can be electrified and how? So, we came up with this idea to explore the technological potential of direct electrification in several industry applications. This project was conducted in cooperation with Fraunhofer ESI, our technical partner for this study, and DENEF and Energy Innovation. So before delving into that, first I would like to share some 4 main messages that we would like to stick, which are that first, achieving climate neutral industry requires an efficient decarbonization of industrial heat. The second is our main finding is that direct electrification technologies expected to be commercially available by 2035 can meet up to 90% of the final energy demand, not yet electrified by European industries. And this potential is quite interesting also with technologies that are already available. Up to 60% could be reached. Then a broad range of electrification technologies exist to meet specific process needs. Of course, industry is complex, so requires different technologies to decarbonize. There is not one single answer for every process. And finally, of course, there are a number of barriers, and so there is a certain space to intervene with policies, especially at the EU level, but not only. So, first of all, why focusing on process heat? First, its relevance. Process heat accounts for up to 75% of greenhouse gas emissions of European industries. The rest is process emissions that are in they release CO2 as a result of some chemical processes, but are not specifically linked to process heat. And second reason, process is quite relevant for the final energy consumption of industry, especially fossil fuels. As we see, gas is a dominant input here, particularly, but not only in the chemical industries. There's still also quite a lot of solid fossil fuels used, especially iron and steel. And also when it comes to energy demand, we still have, of course, the main energy-intensive sectors, iron and steel, chemicals, non-metallic minerals, also paper industry, and many others, food, and so on. Half of industrial process, half of the final energy consumption for industrial process heat is used for high temperature processes. There's also the other half that is used for low to medium temperature processes. So what was labeled so far as the part that is easier to abate. But quite surprisingly, electricity still occupies a very limited share of industrial process heat. Right now, just 4%. So we'll also see why. According to the, just a reminder that according to the Commission impact assessment for the 90% target of 2040, the electricity share in final energy consumption by industry should double from about 30% to 60% by 2040. So there are a number of technologies that are in scope in our work. Some of them are very well known, industrial heat pumps, electric boilers, in general resistance heating technologies, also electric arc furnaces, which are widely used, for instance, in secondary steel. And these have already quite significant technological maturity. They are widely deployed. And then there are other technologies that are less deployed right now, but they show a significant potential for the in the coming decades. For instance, plasma torches and shockwave heating. This can be applied in several applications. In particular, electric boilers and heat pumps lend themselves more naturally to the low temperature needs, and then a higher temperature range could be covered by, for instance, for steam cracking, calcination, sintering, can be covered by technologies allowing higher capacity and temperature, from resistance heating to induction heating to shockwave, plasma torches, and so on. Of course, all of them have their pros and cons. Heat pumps are very efficient, but their temperature range is more limited than the one of electric boilers, which are in turn less efficient, but could be an interesting option if used in a hybrid way for a lesser number of full load hours in combination with other technologies. Resistance heating can cover quite a lot of temperature and capacity range, but there are certain technical challenges. The one is the low energy density, so it requires a lot of space, not ideal for some of the processes. Others are limited to the use with conductive materials, especially induction heating or electric arc furnaces, shockwave heating and plasma torches are quite relevant for high temperature processes and high capacity, especially when there are certain space constraints, but they come with the drawbacks of not being widely commercially available yet. So we estimated the overall electrification potential of the European industrial sector. We went sector by sector, and here we came to the result that through all these technologies, these are technologies that are supposed to be commercially available by 2035, so we did not model other technologies that might come later, especially because there is a large number of current industrial assets that require reinvestment in the coming decade. So we decided to focus only on this one. And with these ones, we can reach an electrification potential of up to 90% of the final energy demand that is not yet electrified. There are still some space. There is still some space, of course, for molecule-based heating, especially in the iron and steel sector, and a little bit also in the non-metallic mineral sector. We also tried to model 3 different cases of penetration of direct electrification technologies to look it in comparison with the main, let's say, potential competitor, meaning indirect electrification via hydrogen, to look more at the, let's say, systemic electrification need. Since this is supposed to be green electricity, we realized that with the deployment, with the higher deployment of direct electrification technology, there is a lesser need of additional renewable energy deployment. Of course, there are certain intervals. The case 1 reproduces this 90% potential. Case 2 has a more eclectic mix of direct and indirect electrification. And then there is the third case where we assume that the entire decarbonisation of process heat is conducted by using green hydrogen, and this, of course, requires a significantly higher deployment of renewable energy. So the technical barriers, as we have seen, are quite limited. They are, of course, still present in demand for feedstock, reducing agents, and very high density. Our suggestion is to focus on the other barriers, the economic and the organizational barriers. First, the economic barriers. The energy prices are the largest component in the total cost of ownership of heating installation. In some cases, higher efficiency of certain electrification technologies can offset the higher electricity prices, but not everywhere. So there is some rationale for policy to address this barrier for a quicker deployment of electrification across industry. And then there are a number of organizational barriers. This pertain to infrastructure bottlenecks. Of course, the grid is not yet ready for this type of electrification deployment. The technical lifetime of legacy installations, and then the challenging integration in on-site production system. One case in point is, of course, heat pumps. They require a certain change in the way things are done compared to electric boilers, which are less efficient but can more immediately replace other fossil-based technologies such as gas boilers. We have, to this extent, some suggestion for policy to step in. First, establishing an industrial direct electrification technology alliance on the basis of what was done already, for instance, for batteries, for hydrogen, and so on. Set deployment and phase out targets and net zero standards for new installation. This can greatly help demand visibility, especially for new technologies. Incorporate industrial direct electrification technology into the EU clean tech funding. Right now, it's not necessarily the case for many of the ones that we have seen. The clarify stated rules on industrial power price for a strategic sector. Of course, we believe that this needs to also come with a certain degree of conditionality to make sure that this help does not necessarily end up just rewarding incumbent, but can really drive electrification in sectors that are not electrified yet. And finally, integrating industrial electrification in grid expansion planning. This is really relevant because infrastructure still remains one of the main bottlenecks. So I will be stopping here. Thanks a lot for your attention.
So to do a quick handover, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jan Rosenau, who is European Program Director at Regulatory Assistance Project, and for some time now, quite a preeminent thought leader and voice on electrification. If you don't yet follow him on LinkedIn, Twitter, no longer Twitter and X, but Blue Sky and other nice platforms, please do. You won't regret it. So with no further ado, over to Jan to present.
Thank you for the free advert there, Andreas, and welcome everybody online. Actually, I don't know how many people we have online, but I hope quite a few, because we had quite a lot of interest, I think, when we advertised this event. When I started to look at industrial decarbonisation, I was actually coming from a position thinking that clearly most of industrial heat will need molecules to be decarbonised. And I think that is still a dogma that persists in policymakers' circles, industry itself. But actually, when you look at some of the evidence, like the Agora study, the Fraunhofer work that's been done, and also work by others like Silvia Madeddu, it completely changes your thinking. And you see actually electrification is a game changer. And in fact, that's what the European Commission has said in its impact assessment itself, where indeed we see a very significant increase in electrification. What I want to cover in the next few minutes, and I only have 5 or 6 minutes really to run through this, is some of the key findings for a forthcoming report that we launch tomorrow. So you're going to see that maybe in the news. I'm not sure it's going to make headlines, but it will certainly get some coverage, I hope. And I'm just going to draw on that very briefly in my presentation today. Quickly, you all know this, but only 3%, maybe 4% now, this data is slightly out of date, is currently electricity in the industrial process heat segment of industrial energy use. And most of it is currently from fossil fuels. That's why about 1/5 of our emissions in Europe come from process heat in industry. So we have to decarbonize that, otherwise we stand no chance in meeting those ambitious climate targets. So the question is, how do we do that? And one of the key levers, as I said, is electrification. This is taken, and Marco, you already mentioned these figures, but I think repeating the same message cannot hurt. This is taken directly from the impact assessment of the Commission that came out in February of the 2040 and 2050 climate targets, and it indicates indeed a doubling of the share of electricity in the industrial sector. So very, very ambitious growth trajectory. You could go even further. I mean, some other studies suggest a much higher share, but even meeting that requires a massive change in the current policy and regulatory framework that we have. Why is that? And why is it only 3% or 4% at the moment? Well, you can see it on this slide here, and Marco also mentioned some of the barriers. We've done a fairly extensive literature review and talked to industry stakeholders, trying to distill the main barriers. I'm not going to go through this, don't you worry. I'm not going to go through this one by one. But there are 4 main categories of barriers that we see: economic, knowledge, infrastructure, and technological. And you can see much more in the report. There's much more detail on it. We're also writing an academic paper that's hopefully going to come out next year. But these barriers essentially prevent us from moving from the only 3 or 4% to a much higher share of electrified process heat in Europe. What this also suggests is that we need a variety of policies. And I'm going to come to that in a minute. But when you look at the barriers, I think what is interesting is which are the most important barriers. And you see that here in a fairly dated survey now. There's not great evidence in Europe. It's better evidence in the US. What are the top barriers from an industrial perspective, from the demand side, from the factories? And this is from a Swiss study. And the top 3 barriers are all about economic issues. So high upfront costs, operational costs are too high. Fossil fuels are cheaper than using electricity. And those barriers are clearly very important. They're not the only ones, but very important when it comes to addressing this gap between the potential and the current deployment. And I'm just going to zoom in on one of them, which is the ratio of electricity to gas prices in Europe. Many of you will have seen this in the residential sector and the building sector play out, but it's the same in the industrial sector. You see in many countries that electricity costs multiple times more than gas prices. Partly driven by, and you see this in the graphic here, driven by taxation, levies and taxes on electricity. That can be reformed, that is a policy choice. And for many of the technologies that Marco mentioned, unless you use a heat pump where you have very high efficiency gains, these ratios really stand in the way. You know, if you change from a gas boiler to an electric boiler, your efficiency gains won't be substantial enough to offset this big price gap between gas and electricity. So another interesting finding from our work that hasn't been shared yet publicly, it's the first time I think we share this, is we've done a little survey of member state experts, and you see this on the next slide, and it's an expert survey. So you see here the support for industrial electrification in different member states as perceived by the experts who we asked. In other words, a very high support would be 5. So this means the regulatory framework in those countries is very supportive. If it's 0, it means there's 0 support for industrial electrification as perceived by the people who we asked. And you can see this for all of the 4 categories, fairly low scores amongst the experts who we've asked, which again indicates that there is some work to be done. This is, of course, highly subjective and qualitative in nature, but it shows again that the industry perceives that there is a need for action on the policy side. And here is an attempt to map, and I'm not going to go through this again, it's in the report, you can see it in more detail, an attempt to map the barriers, some of which Marco has listed and some of which I have listed, against potential policy solutions that can address them. And again, remember that there's so many different barriers and different categories. Just relying on the ETS, a price mechanism, or just relying on information campaigns is not going to crack this problem. We need a whole portfolio of policies because of the way these barriers affect different parts of industry in different ways. And this is the final bit. Oh, the slide haven't changed. Apologies for that, and apologies online. This is the slide I wanted to show when I was making the point about the barriers and the policies. Thanks, Sam, for reminding me. So to wrap up, we have a 10-point action plan for the industrial electrification strategy that Europe could adopt. And you see this on this slide here. Again, I don't have time to go through it one by one, but just to highlight a few. So we have targets in Europe for energy efficiency, renewables, greenhouse gas reduction, which have served us well. We have nothing of the sort for electrification, even though electrification is becoming the key lever for industrial decarbonisation. One of the suggestions is to have at least indicative targets for electrification of industry. And let me pick another one up here, which is around state aid guidelines. Again, Agora made this point before. You know, we currently have a situation where it's not so easy to support electrification of industrial processes because of state aid guidelines that could take, the Commission could take another look and make it easier for member states to support industry electrification there. I'm going to fast forward to the last slide with the action plan here. The Grids Action Plan is a great opportunity to look at infrastructure, and we see already in some places grid connection being a major blockage where it takes months or even years to get permission to connect up to the grid. So the Grid Action Plan can provide a way in there, we believe. Funding programs is another one where we find a lot of funding has been provided to hydrogen projects in industry, but not very much for electrification for a variety of reasons. And again, the Commission can use its power to make grants available, funding available to industrial players who want to innovate to drive electrification forward. That's all I wanted to say. This is the report preview that we're going to launch tomorrow. So that's going to come out, I think, at 1 minute past midnight. So it's if you wake up early, you can, and you can't sleep, please do read this report. It might, hopefully, it doesn't help you get back to sleep. And I hope you will enjoy reading it. And sorry I had to run through this so quickly, but we have a great panel of experts, and I really wanted to leave enough time. This is just giving you a little teaser. Please do look up the report. There's a lot more detail in there. But thanks for listening, and thanks for people online for listening to me and to Marco and Emily. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, and I always love the rap titles. Now to introduce this great panel we have today. First, we have Tom House, whose current title is Advisor for Green Transition and Market Regulation at DG Energy. Please welcome us, or join us on the stage. Thank you. Malgosia Rybak, who is Climate Change and Energy Director at CEPI, the European Association for the Paper Industry. Margareta Ronchevich, who is a Policy Officer at EASE, the European Association for the Storage of Energy, providing an energy storage perspective, and Domien van Genechten, who is a Program Lead at the Berlin office of E3G, and focusing a lot on industry decarbonization. So, to get cracking, we had two dense and quickly delivered presentations, but providing a lot of food for thought with a lot of overlap. Tom, one of the pictures stood out, which was this massive jump in electricity demand that we have in the 2040 impact assessment. So that's already something the Commission is seeing as one. I mean, electrification is obviously a main lever for decarbonization for industry, already in Commission scenarios. So what regulatory and funding framework, I mean, because I think it's also about state aid, could support the increase of electrification at this scale?
Thanks. Good morning, and thanks for the chance to be here. I've never seen a topic where there seem to be more open doors to push very easily on. No one seems to be objecting to this whole narrative, which is, I don't know if it's because we're missing someone in the audience, or whether there really is quite a consent. We felt this yesterday as well. There's lots of narratives I mean, I agree. I think I'm going to agree with everything that you publish. I've agreed with everything you publish. There's a lot of consensus and there are a lot of good ideas out there. And it's great that these are coming out now because we're in the process with the new momentum of the new Commission. We're ready to try to take the measures that make us jump. First, we've got to jump to the 30 because we seem to be stuck at the 23%. And then to drive that further to double it, as you've all pointed out. So that's the expectation. At least that's what all the models generally indicate in terms of anything that's a remotely cost-effective decarbonisation of the economy. And we think we've got a good starting framework for all of that. I mean, if you look at the wealth of new legislation that's been adopted in the last 3 or 4 years, we certainly hope that is sufficient and complete. I think it is. I think that there's lots there. I mean, we all know that it's all new and still needs to be implemented. So it's not that we can say that any of that has proven itself worthy or unworthy yet. We expect it to be worthy and up to the job when it's completely implemented. And that will already be tackling, I think, a lot of the barriers that you mentioned. We combine that with the prospect of the new MFF. And all the hopes that brings. I mean, okay, I mean, the MFF, it's not a lot given the entire scale of operation of decarbonising Europe. We're talking tens of billions a year compared to the needs of hundreds of billions a year over decades. But it does help, particularly in terms of demonstration projects. Hopefully it can help with deployment. We try to leverage it to make the money go further, so it can be seed money and demonstration money. But you both touched on the state aid element. That will continue to be an important part. State aid and the general taxation regime, 2 points you flagged up. So I could go through all the 10 points and say, yes, I agree. But I guess the message is that it's great that you're fleshing this out. It's good for us that you have this background data that we can use, the precise suggestions of how to apply solutions, or at least what we can do at European level, and then how we can help roll that out at member state level, and what we can do in financing terms. So I think I would just leave it there. We welcome the initiatives, the data that you bring, and we're very open at this stage to the ideas, whether that's traditional European approaches or non-traditional approaches in terms of setting up more alliances, or how do we roll that out on the ground. I think, for me, one of the big changes that we might need to take forward in this Commission is, I have a sense that we can't be just leaving it at a national level now to implement. Things have become tighter, more difficult at a national level. So just giving the targets and leaving it to member states, I think there's a feeling that that's not as effective as it has been in the past, and we'll need to develop different types of initiatives that help us get closer to the ground, a bit more granular, with industry, with all the usual stakeholders that one would need to engage with to make this actually happen on the ground. For me, that's a slightly new dimension that we might like to flesh out. So those are my first thoughts, but thank you for the study.
Thank you very much. And I took away from that, obviously, your final point on the potentially new focus on also finding solutions at EU level. On the other hand, also, there's a lot to implement. There's already a lot there. Nonetheless, in this direction, maybe, still it'd be great to hear your thoughts on if you think there are any specific policy files that might still need revision. If you have any first thoughts on that, beyond the implementation of the things you have on your plate. And a second question. Many years ago, I was a Blue Book trainee in the unit. You were deputy head of unit, and you were leading a team on the first energy prices and costs report. So 10 years later, I think over 10 years later, it's a new topic under discussion. It's at the top of the agenda, energy and prices and costs. What can the Commission do?
First, on topics for revision of legislation, at this stage I don't feel the need to go beyond the mission letters, which is to say that we have a vast amount to implement. We think it's going to achieve a great deal when it is implemented. We flagged that we do want to look at the CCS legislative regime as an area that could need support to more facilitate the development of that technology. We're also reviewing the security of supply framework in light of recent events to see what more could be done there. But really, in terms of the decarbonisation perspective, the market support perspective, we have so much there, which brings me to the second point, which is about how do we tackle the issue of prices and costs, high prices and costs. And we've learned a lot there. I mean, for us, please tell me if I'm wrong in my perspective, but we got through the price spikes of the energy crisis pretty well, pretty much thanks to integrated European markets and grids and networks. The prices were politically, they were certainly uncomfortably high, but the tools we had at our disposal to cope with that, both in the short term and those we've improved for the medium term, are all still with us today. So we do have tools there, but given that affordability for households, affordability linked to competitiveness for industry is really obviously it was the essence of the Draghi report, but it's also very much the key policy perspective of the new Commission. Affordability, and I mean the Affordability Action Plan will come out in the first 100 days, together with the Clean Industrial Deal, and that will look at how we can better use the tools we know we have at European, but also at member state level. I mean, we did this last time as well. We came out with a toolkit, if you remember, during the crisis, which says, look, we don't control your taxation regimes, but here's what we would suggest you do with your taxation regimes. So it doesn't need to be European competence that we roll out. There's lots of good practice at a national level or regional or local level that can be recalled and emphasized. And that goes on financing, but it also goes with administrative barriers that we face. And again, we push a lot on our favorite example of permitting, and we have wonderful European legislation which says that all of this should be faster and shorter and one-stop shopping and so on. And that's rolled out in some member states. there again, our narrative is that it looks like Germany made great use of this new legislation, and there's been a significant speeding up of permitting, which has contributed to a significant boost in the rollout of renewables. Exactly what we want to see. So these are all tools that will be re-emphasized in the future.
Thank you. So take away from that, there's really a lot that can still be done in actually making use of best practices and discussing it more intensely at European level in almost European semester type format. And thank you for those first thoughts. Let me go over to our next panelist, Malgosia. You represent the paper industry, one of the sectors that was highlighted here as one that I think could, in the sense, more easily electrify that it's often lower temperature heating, that process heat that needs to be replaced, often fossil or otherwise provided today. What are the economic and technical barriers your industry, however, is still facing in actually making this switch, or why is it not happening at the speed that the 60% scenario would show?
Yeah, Jan, Tom, we need to talk. I mean, there's one thing in the recommendations that I feel very strongly about is the target. But I'll come back to that later. So having seen the slides, they look okay. I mean, in the sense that this is what our statistics also show. 70% of our energy goes into heat generation, and this is where we have the problem. But where we slightly disagree with the narrative that is presented today, electrification shouldn't be the goal in itself. Decarbonization is a goal in itself. And this is where we're working towards too. So when we look at our industry, we're operating, probably in your head you already have Sweden and Finland, but in reality we're operating throughout Europe. So it's 870 mills that are operating from Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, Germany, Poland, you name it, you have it. And that in essence means that there are going to have different ways to decarbonize. Meaning that if there's going to be, for some strange reason, biomethane available to switch from natural gas to biomethane when you have high efficiency cogeneration unit, why shouldn't you use this? If there's going to be a possibility to electrify using a heat pump, you should be able to do it as well. But there is an element, obviously technology is one thing, but another thing is also the risk that a company would like to take. And switching from the technologies that we know to technologies that are being introduced in the industry takes a risk. It's also a financial risk when we're going to talk about switching from using natural gas, and natural gas is 30% of our energy consumption, another 60% is biomass. So here the element of price and OPEX is obviously plays a big role in industry like ours. And when we talk about decarbonization, and colleagues from East will know about that, we often talk about collaboration. So it is not only about the pulp and paper industry willing to invest in heat pump, let's say. It's also about understanding the value chain. It's also understanding how you can integrate different solutions. So what we see right now and what we were discussing yesterday on demand-side flexibility, for the time being, it takes a combination, a hybrid combination of a cogeneration unit together with an e-boiler. Maybe somewhere there's going to be storage integrated. Maybe we're going to see thermal, solar thermal, or maybe we're going to see geothermal. So there are multiple ways. Why we talk so much about access to affordable fossil-free energy, it almost sounds like a cliche, but there are certain aspects to this. One of them is infrastructure. We also saw that in the slides, and that's a huge bottleneck. Even if you want to do demand-side flexibility, infrastructure is a bottleneck. If you want to fully electrify, infrastructure is a bottleneck. It's also availability of energy, because if you notice on those slides, in the scenario when we use a mix of different energy sources, we use essentially less energy than in the scenario when it's fully electrified, in the case what was shown on the slides. And it's also about what sort of energy we're talking about, because we're obviously aiming for fossil-free. So there are multiple elements that in the real world are taken into consideration when you want to decarbonize, rather than when you want to electrify as such.
Thank you for these first thoughts. So this was a question that was really targeted at rather looking at the stumbling blocks, the barriers. Now, we know that electrification is already taking place in your industry today. It's not as if this is something that is the distant future. So could you highlight some successful examples and maybe what lessons we can draw from why those cases are succeeding?
Is going to be our collaboration with European Heat Pump Association. And why I'm saying that it was a success, it's been years of conversation. And that took us changing our approach to using heat pumps, because in the mills, managers, I'm being told, are used to doing things in a certain way that work. So it's about certain temperature, it's about certain pressure, it's about operating in a certain manner. And when you clash those expectations with the colleagues from the Heat Pump Association, they were like, do you really need that? Do you really need this temperature? Do you really need that pressure? And after years of working, we were able to come up with 2 technical papers that would make integration of heat pumps more cost effective, meaning using what is in the market in a different technological setup. By the way, how many of you are policy geeks? By show of hands, and how many of you are technical guys? Okay, I'll try to balance. So we know of the investments in heat pumps happening as we speak in paper mills. Something that is present in the paper mills that it's also allowing for grid balancing is demand-side flexibility. And these are investments that we see in e-boilers, but it's in hybrid systems. So basically now we're, I say lucky ones, but it has its challenges itself. We are able to provide flexibility to the grid while switching from e-boiler to a cogeneration unit quite flexibly. So on the one hand, it's about technologies that are out there, investing in them, but it's also about building capabilities in companies, because essentially what we're talking about is building a team that is able to play on the electricity market. This is not unheard of in our industry. We're already selling 10 terawatt hours of electricity to the system, but it also means that we need to have a visibility of what type of electricity is going to be available to us. And it's also a matter of infrastructure, because when you want to provide more demand-side response, you will need to add connection to the grid as well, because essentially you're going to use more electricity than you're used to. So there are examples of that, and we hope that we will be able to present a publication that we do every 2 years next April with examples of those.
Thank you very much. And maybe just a concluding question to round out this first intervention, which is, so you laid out a lot of factors here also on the technical side, or the cultural side even one could say, and the collaboration that what needs to be established. To go back on to the policy geeks, what is the framework that you think would be needed now going forward to allow for a flourishing electrification next to other technology options?
It's a difficult question in the sense that we just went through lots of negotiations now with the electricity market design, not to mention Fit for 55. And we talk a lot about simplification of regulation. That's one way forward, but this is why I very strongly feel about the targets. I'm not sure what was the idea behind setting up an electrification target for the industry itself. There is lots of other questions, how it would play with all the other sub-targets that we have for it's non-binding for renewable heat in industry, for RNFBOs, for different types of renewables, how it's going to play out with energy efficiency directive. We live in the world when a company is exposed to many different requirements, and what we need right now is a little bit of breathing space so that we can figure out how to decarbonize in a cost-effective way.
So, rather a plea to not add too much additional complexity to the existing policy mix. Okay, so over to Margareta, who, as I've introduced, is working essentially for, in this case, well, the broader solar industry, storage industry, but today can add the perspective of thermal storage, I think, in this context. So how can thermal storage serve as a solution to really help us bridge, but also other storage solutions help us bridge this challenge of integrating industrial processes into the electricity grid on the one hand, but also into company structures and their whole processes?
Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting us. And indeed, so I'm a policy officer for European Association for Storage of Energy. We have almost 80 members now who work in the energy storage value chain. So they can be technology providers, utility companies, research centers, and so on. And specifically what is special about our work is that we represent different types of energy storage technologies. So we have electrochemical, we have mechanical, but as you mentioned, we also have thermal energy storage, which is particularly interesting when we talk about industry decarbonization. So today, and this is something that we do work together closely with Malkozia and with the Confederation of European Paper Industries. We do also believe that electrification shouldn't be an end goal. Rather, it should be a tool or a mean where you achieve decarbonization and decarbonization targets. And to go back to your questions, how can we do that? You know, when we start from implementing energy storage solutions on, let's say, smaller scale, so use cases such as in industry or business, such as in industry decarbonization, you're not just implementing solutions that essentially what the technology does in its kind of the most basic sense is storing a medium to use electricity at the delayed response or delayed time. So you're not just storing electricity, but you're also building a business case for your company, and you are also creating opportunity for industries to generate new revenue streams. For example, this can be done through reusing waste heat. It can be done with participating in electricity markets or leveraging tools such as arbitrage or FCR. And this also very much depends on the member state and how it's regulated on the member state level as well. So in a nutshell, you are not just a part of electricity market now, but you're really contributing actively into it as well, alongside with the environmental benefits that these technologies do bring to. And then when you bring it onto the next level, where you can bring it to a true systematic or systemic progress, when you have electrification that is supported by the energy storage technologies, you can also participate in grid balancing and grid stability. It can reinforce the energy networks and accelerate the adoption of renewable energy sources, which in return have been proved so far to be the most affordable, the best source of energy as we know it. When we speak again then about the industry decarbonizations, in the past, it was a big cost to national grid. But now, again, if you implement energy storage technologies, you have a true opportunity to change, to shift this paradigm, and also that you can actively support the system while it's being decarbonized as well. So you're not just a strain on the grid, but an active participant in it as well. So then we take it to another level, let's say to a European or to a global level. This, in return, these technologies, what Emmeline mentioned before, when we are, for a lot of this sector, we're still reliant on in international players, whether if it's for resources or for the specific segments or parts of certain technologies. But what is interesting about thermal energy storage is that it can truly be made and produced with local resources. It can be, the production and the implementation can truly be localized. Of course, this has an impact on retaining jobs in the European Union, on the competitiveness, on reinforcing manufacturing at the European Union, which, as you mentioned, Draghi report before, it is a big part of it. Of course, these things were addressed also to an extent in the Net Zero Industry Act and other legislations too. So to kind of just sum it up, yes, if we implement energy storage solutions, starting from the, let's say, smaller business cases, we can really build up to a strong energy system in Europe that is autonomous, that is safe and secure, and that is resilient.
Thank you. And you've mentioned several storage technologies already, but maybe do you have any thoughts on any particularly innovative storage technologies that could really help or are coming on the market or emerging here that could serve as a solution here?
I always forget this. Sorry. I would like to go back maybe also to the thermal energy storage technologies, because they get overlooked quite a lot, especially in the industry decarbonization discussion. One of the strongest, let's say, contenders that, not to single out, but maybe the first thing that comes to mind is in molten salt technologies that have been known to be basically commercially ready, but because of some regulatory and that were mentioned, some regulatory barriers, they cannot be commercially deployed to the extent that we would like to. And also, yeah, I don't want to put Malhosia on spot, but some of their members do use these technologies in the pulp and paper industry. And also, something that is interesting about them is that they can be adaptable to different temperature ranges, different time frames, and so on. So, for example, thermal energy storage and molten salt technologies would be interesting to look at.
Maybe one last question. So we had here on the one hand with Malgosia the perspective that demand-side flexibility would need to also go hand in hand with grid reinforcement. And you spoke to that, but to what extent is kind of the grid reinforcement the precondition for a lot of what you're talking about? To what extent does it avoid grid reinforcement needs?
I think it's okay now. Yeah, so of course, we cannot say that the grid infrastructure, that reinforcement of grid is not necessary in Europe. Europe, in general, and notoriously has an old grid system, an old grid network. So the investment in the grid infrastructure is always welcome, of course, and the renewing of the grid infrastructure. But what is also important to notice for specifically energy storage technologies is that there are non-volatile solutions where you can implement them regardless of basically how bad the grid is, and they actually benefit it because they can help the grid balancing, they can help it stabilize and different. So not to say that it's not that it's not a priority. Of course, better grid also means better services, electricity services around Europe, but it is a technology that has proven to function even in the poorer conditions of the grid.
Thank you very much. And now to our last panelist, Domine. We've touched on a lot of different topics here, some economic challenges, some technical challenges, cultural challenges. let's go back to politics. What do you see here as the biggest political challenges for direct electrification?
That's how it works. Okay, thanks. And hi, everyone. Also on behalf of E3G, welcome to today's event. We actually also published a briefing on this a few months ago. If you haven't read it, look it up. I won't bore you with the details because, no surprise, we come to very similar conclusions as both Agora and colleagues at REP, which is also why we came together to organize this together. But, I mean, to take a step back, I guess, and a lot has been said already, but if you look at, I guess, like the last 5-10 years, like working on industry decarbonization, I think as Jan mentioned, like a lot of the conversations were around changing molecules, first and foremost, changing fuels, doing some energy efficiency, and maybe if you don't get there that way, do some CCS on the back of things. If you look at the technologies that have made most progress over the last like 5 to 10 years, it is the electrification technologies that have done so. That goes hand in hand with the fact that you know, costs and energy prices, or electricity prices generated by renewables have also been dropping a lot faster than most of us would have foreseen like a decade ago, which means that we're in a completely different context than we were a few years ago. And you see that in the models, right? And I think a lot of the work that we've done, the work from the Commission, if you look at the work from the IEA, like every new run of the model basically shows more electrification of the system because it just happens to be the most energy efficient and quite often cost efficient direction of travel to decarbonize not all of the economy, but an increasingly bigger share of the economy. But political and economic reality doesn't follow, right? And that is the big problem that I think a lot of us have been realizing, and we're trying to understand why that is and what we can do about it. I think in terms of sort of some of the political barriers that we see is, I think, you mentioned culture or information. I don't know really, you can't really pinpoint it, but like in a lot of our conversations with policymakers, they don't necessarily see electrification as something they need to work on. Electricity is something that is there. We've been using it for not just decades, more than a century already. Policymakers and politicians get excited by fancy new things, being it hydrogen, being it carbon capture and storage, things that they haven't built yet. And they don't necessarily understand that when it comes to electrification, you have a lot of the same barriers that you have for scaling other technologies, being that learning of what technologies are available, so an information deficit, being that building out new infrastructure, when it comes to electrification, that is strengthening the existing infrastructure around grids, or scaling new technologies, which means support for manufacturing, support for R&D, creating lead markets for the deployment of those technologies. So it's a very classical problem that most politicians don't necessarily understand unless you tell them. I think beyond that, and that's probably a bit more of a sensitive topic, I guess, but if you look at who has the loudest voice in policymaking circles, it's quite often those that either argue for the system as it is, the incumbents, or when it comes to industry specifically, are those industries that have very high temperature heat needs, where traditionally the solutions were not seen as electrifying, but as doing things like changing your feedstocks, changing your molecules, or doing CCS, which means that the vast majority of events and policymaker discussions you're at, that's the thing you hear, right? And I think that realization is changing, which is good. And I think the bottom line is that while we have seen very dedicated action, especially in the last few years, around some of those other alternative mitigation pathways, we haven't seen that on direct electrification, specifically in industry. And I think that's what we would like to see. And it's just a very opportune moment to do so, right? Like, this is not just about decarbonization. I mean, it's also about security. electrification means that you can get your energy domestically, produced domestically, which is super important. Our fossil fuel imports bill from last year still amounted to about 450 billion euros, which is a lot of money. You can do a lot of other things with that. And also, I think crucially, and I very much hear you on the reluctance to have targets, but I think what we do need is sort of clarity on the trajectory. And in terms of information for those that are either designing the energy systems, they don't always know what to expect in terms of future energy demand from industry. So it's a planning issue. I think in terms of getting as many low-cost renewables into the grids as fast as possible to push out gas, which is still a big part of the problem when it comes to the electricity costs. They will increasingly need additional demand, otherwise they don't have a business case to deploy those renewables. So it is a very opportune moment. And I guess, I'm not sure if it's I'm sure we'll touch upon it later, but in terms of last political barriers, I guess, and somewhat curious that no one has mentioned this to date, or so far, is how we tax energy, right? I mean, the cost differential of electricity versus conventional or fossil-based energy is quite known and quite evident, and a big chunk of that is because the share of the electricity cost coming from taxes and levies, etc., is a lot higher than it is for fossil energy, and that's in the end political decision to be made. And we know a proposal has been in discussions in the European Council for how long is it now? Like 3-4 years, and we have been talking about it for much longer than that. But if we're serious about accelerating direct electrification of industry, that sort of should be on the top of your list, and policymakers should find the political courage to come to agreements there.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I think is a good moment to take some questions first for online, if we have them. But let's see, what's the situation like, Marco?
Yes, we have some online questions.
Marco, could you maybe?
Some have been already replied in the course of the conversation, so I will skip on them. Thanks. So it's about how do you see the potential for thermal storage across pulp and paper industry. Then we have a question about, since it was mentioned, also support to carbon capture and storage before in the current mandate, if it's not seen as a sort of antithetic with the objective of promoting electrification for industry. And other questions are mostly about infrastructure and how to create the right framework to support.
So I wasn't able to note those down. I hope those who were directly spoken to have, if you would like to respond, please do so.
Yes, on thermal storage, I took notice of your question, not to deviate from the person online who's very eager to know, but you asked the question like whether technologies are ready, so and whether there's new innovation to come online. I think that what we're experiencing right now, it's more how to put different technologies together, and this is the innovation. So if you are going to integrate thermal storage on site together with solar thermal or geothermal, and on top of that you want to electrify it a little bit your process, but your site has been there for decades, so maybe you need to integrate it with something that is already existing on site. The innovation is actually to understand how to put those technologies together. And innovation is also how to integrate a single technologies in a paper mill. So for example, heat pump. I already mentioned there's 870 paper mills out there. And again, it's going to sound like a cliche, but there is no identical paper mill. So all of them are different. So essentially it means that if now we're going to install a heat pump in one mill, it's not a given that the same heat pump is going to work in a different place. So innovation is also going to be how to make it more cost effectively integrated. And on this, actually, when I was listening to other speakers, Decarbonisation Accelerator Act, that would be great. If we could support net zero industry of technologies deployment on site with faster permitting, that would be great, because this is something that we were missing from Net Zero Industry Act. So there is a potential we see for thermal, coming back to the question. We see the potential, we see the investments, but it's going to depend on where you are, what is available to you, what is the national legislation as well. But I'm looking also at you to support on that.
No, exactly. It's okay if I jump in. Yes, thank you. No, exactly what as Malgosia said. Also, something to keep in mind when speaking about thermal energy storage is that it really also depends, as you said, on the specific use case, and it really depends. So the technology can be adjusted quite easily. So it depends on the material that you use. It can basically make a bigger infrastructure, smaller, so it also really depends. It really depends on your use case. But one of the some of the barriers that we would like addressed, especially also for the industry, and to make the business case more appealing, because yes, it is all admirable that these technologies do indeed reinforce the ESG principles, but we unfortunately live in a very capitalistic world where you need to make these business cases not just available, but more appealing to the end users. And one of the ways of doing this is by removing double taxation and double charging, which is something that has been highlighted by our members regardless of the type of technologies that they do. And also, as was mentioned before, simplifying of the bureaucracy, accelerating permitting, which was that was briefly touched by in the Industry Act, but these are some of the things that really can make or break these technologies and put them out there and make them more accessible for end users to actually implement.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, I will now I have 3 questions. We'll take them all in this order from the back to the front.
Okay. Hello, Christian Scheible from EEB, NGO. I have a question to SEPI, but maybe other industry folks in the room, if they are. So we hear a lot of talk about how committed the industry is in decarbonization and the climate neutrality goal by 2050. Everyone has done its roadmap homework, but there's the but, the business case you mentioned. And I saw on the top 3 priorities the ID, like Industrial Emissions Directive, so command and control approaches, which also are set on a technology kind of focus. But when we get to it, everyone is stepping back, including SEPI. And there's this informal Industrial Emissions Alliance. Maybe you can change the name by Decarbonization Alliance, for example. That's a suggestion. And really say, okay, is the EU industry still on the path to the zero pollution ambition and the decarbonization, and not just talk about it, but show that you really mean it. So when we talk about standards, EU standards, which kick in, by the way, only 8 years by the moment we define them. There's this deep industrial transformation, BATs that get even public money and support, that you really show that you want to do it and you will do it. So that's the first recommendation, maybe, and the hard part is the existing plants. So how we can make the business case real for the existing plants to convert. It's 10, 15 years investment scale. So what do you suggest there? I mean, do we need to internalize external costs, air pollution, clear win-wins? Is this something that you can do? For example, on air pollution taxation, or can we modify the state aid guidelines to account for that? And maybe this is a question also back to Agora. What do you mean with strategic sectors? Is it only energy-related applications? And then a question back to the industry: how much are you chipping in from your turnover, annual turnovers, for example, to make this low-cost, affordable electrons or molecules being taken up in the market? Because you all want this, but how much are you putting in yourself in terms of your turnover profits to make that happen? And not only expect member states' public support for doing that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll interpret this more of a statement than a question, but a good encouragement to get more specific. And here, next question.
Hello, I'm Bielo Gausi from the European Trade Union Institute, ETY. One question is on the labor and social effects of these technologies that was actually not talked about here. So the question actually is whether there is a difference between the direct electrification technology and the hydrogen-based electrification in terms of a disruptive effect on the labor process and on the industries. Is there a regional effect in terms of infrastructure availability? And considering all these, so what are the pros and the cons? So this is also kind of a barrier that was probably not taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if any panelist wants to comment on that, but we have one more question, I'll take that first. It's up here in the front. Oh, sorry, there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Marta Navarrete from Iberdrola. I wanted to bring in the perspective of a renewable energy developer. I think I would like to congratulate Agora and RAP for these reports because I think it really points at the need now. So we have a competitive problem in Europe and electrification can really help. Actually, what we see in the countries where we have a high deployment of renewables, like Spain, is that the prices in the spot market of electricity are already going down to the point that we have many hours with negative prices. Now, this is very good to have low prices because it's an advantage for the industry. At the same time, we have a lot of curtailment, renewable electricity that is being curtailed. So this renewable power is not reaching the industry because there are problems of grids and because the electrification rate hasn't accelerated. And actually, we also have a problem from our side, from the renewable development perspective, because we have no business case. So I'm afraid that if we are not able to actually electrify industry, and we have an industry that is what we call the low-hanging fruit, is that industry that is below 500 degrees that can electrify with technologies today that are ready, with hybrid solutions, maybe like Malgosia was mentioning. We are meeting that industry, we are offering solutions, but we find in many cases, regulatory barriers that are easily solved. So I really hope that the Clean Industrial Deal focuses on this, because otherwise we are not going to be able to deploy renewables, and renewables are the solution for the competitive problem of Europe. And my question is, I also hear a lot in the current debate this idea of cross-subsidiation. So a lot of the focus is on a certain type of industries and that are in risk, that's true. But the problem is if we subsidize these industries at the expense of other industries through the electricity bill, we're just putting barriers to electrification and we're actually making the problem even bigger. So my question for the panel is, are you worried about this? What can be done to avoid this kind of crop subsidiation that I think it's going to be really problematic if it's included in the Clean Industrial Deal? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dustin Benton, Forefront Advisors. I want to raise the elephant in the room, which is American gas prices, which are a fifth of Europe's gas prices. Now, I believe that cheap renewables and cheap heat pumps can be cost competitive, but maybe in, what, a decade's time? So the question is, what gets us from today to the cheap clean energy nirvana without offshoring energy to America?
Okay, so I think we had quite a few very interesting questions. I would summarize the ones that I interpreted as a question as, so on the one hand, is there a disruption in terms of labor and industries, a trade-off between electrification and hydrogen specifically, or other technologies? So if you have any comment, I think Domine, you might want to comment on that, I'm not sure. There's the issue of, on the one hand, I think, Margosia, you talked a lot about integrating things and talking to partners. I'm sure you also talk to the renewable energy developers and the renewable energy industry. Exactly, I'm sure you do. But how are you thinking about integrating your business model and their business model? So that's a win-win. But then also cross-subsidization came up. Is there a trade-off between supporting industry electrification and household electrification? I'll interpret it that way. And finally, our gas price is just too damn cheap for this to take off in the coming years. So, and what do we do about it? So that's a lot. And I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to respond to whatever you want to respond to. And I'm also going to give you, ask you to, well, no, I'll have a closing question afterwards. So, just a few minutes. We don't have so much time.
Okay, maybe I will focus on the labor question that was asked first, because it is something that we also addressed within our work. Some of the technologies that our members work on, for example, batteries, they tend to, of course, have, as it's known, questionable sourcing of materials, questionable processing, and so on. And this is something that has been addressed on the European level through the battery regulation, which entered into force last year in August 2023, which really puts strict policies in for the manufacturers and for economic operators who put batteries on the European market. So on the EU market, this battery needs to go through extensive, and it needs to have really high standards if you want to put it. Now, in terms of if you want to implement these technologies in the industry, yes, there can be a disruption to, for example, processes. There, of course, if you are going to put a technology, if it wasn't planned in the original phase when you were building a factory or something similar, yes, there is going to be a disruption, and this is something that makes the going back to the business case again, less attractive. And this is something that we would also like addressed, where you get certain subsidies or you get certain benefits as, okay, because you are going to be losing X amount of time that you could be producing whatever it is that you're producing or working on. This is financial relief or economic relief that could address this potentially. But then again, if you look at the whole picture, this disruption has a significantly less impact as a whole in terms of what you're going to gain from implementing these technologies.
And just pick up. On the labor aspects, just like a few comments. I'm not going to comment on like every specific technology route out there. But for example, I work very closely on steel decarbonisation. And that's a very live discussion there, right? Obviously, blast furnace, primary steel making, most labor intensive. If you do the hydrogen-based route, a bit less labor intensive, but you keep the vast majority of jobs here. If you just go the recycling route, so direct electrification, it's the least amount of jobs. So purely on like a labor aspect, you know, you would choose for the carbon-intensive route or the hydrogen route if you want to decarbonize. I think you can't compare hydrogen with direct electrification because there might not be a hydrogen business case, in the areas where we have current production capacity, basically, of steel making. So I understand and I appreciate that it's like a very big concern. But sometimes to protect and safeguard and future-proof a large chunk of jobs, it might require you to make the choice that has on the surface of it the least jobs protected, which is a bit counterintuitive, I guess, but I think is important to reflect on. On cross-subsidization, you'll see, to read our briefing again, we kind of like dodged, I guess, the bullets of like to what extent do we need to subsidize heavy industry for sort of like making direct electrification economic, because it just it requires a balancing of a whole bunch of political trade-offs as well as like technological trade-offs, right? Like there are distributional effects in general, which I think is like super important to consider, especially when we're trying to get citizens to come along in the story. There's a whole bunch of vocational factors to take into account as well. As you said, like electricity is very cheap in Spain. It is not at the moment, in Central Europe, and we don't want to artificially subsidize too much electricity prices where they're never going to be cheap, because that's not going to future-proof those industries. And you have to take system costs into account as well. So this is not necessarily a recommendation, but I think these questions need to be tackled in any credible, electrification action plan, because it requires political direction. And then thirdly, I'm going to dodge the question on gas prices, but I want to touch on the CCS question, which I do think is important. And I think in terms of trade-offs, it really depends on how you design your CCS policy, right? If you're just going to give untargeted subsidies for CCS, for example, or focusing on the energy system, yes, there might be very clear trade-offs. I think when it comes to making smart use of limited public resources, you need to do a whole bunch of, I guess, like targeted decisions on where you send those resources to. When it comes to CCS, like one of the big constraints, next to costs, technical feasibility, etc., is just the question: how much can we store underground, and who are we going to prioritize that storage capacity for? Very similar conversation as with hydrogen. It will be expensive, it will be limited, and we need to be smart about where we, sort of incentivize the uptake of that. I think same with CCS. If we do it that way, I don't see big trade-offs. If we don't do it that way, yeah, I do.
I will not speak on behalf of hydrogen or any technology association, but I know that in our sector we are looking for engineers. So if there are people that are looking for work, we will welcome them with open hands, literally. And we do appreciate the work that we do with trade unions, and they were also part of the Antwerp dialogue on electrification and competitiveness. So the labor element doesn't really disappear from what we do. We don't know each other that well, but I've heard a little bit of sarcasm when you talk about collaboration and integration of technologies. If not, I'm going to talk about it anyway, because at the end of the day, we're all in the same boat. So it's not Marta or I, but it's about figuring out how to help your client, to keep your client in Europe. No, it's as simple as that. We need industry so that all this beautiful electricity, which one day is going to be decarbonized, can be utilized. And the same goes, I see Maria in the back from Wind Europe. We have lots of conversation about this as well. And going back to subsidies, recently, I read this quote, probably from one of the organizations in the room, that you cannot buy competitiveness with subsidies. And I think that there is a lot true in that. So what we're not essentially asking for is subsidies. We're asking for competitiveness and competitive price of energy. And on CCS, yeah, we're in a different position a little bit than colleagues from other industries. So this person who has that question online, please write me an email and we can discuss.
Thank you very much. So just a very quick round, which won't be really an elaborate answer, just the, I'll give you a moment at the end. You can really close it out. For the three past Tom, quickly, what if you had one ask to Tom or one proposal to Tom for the Electrification Action Plan, what would it be? And then I'll let Tom highlight his key takeaway from the discussion, but briefly and respond to whatever he wants to respond to. Just to close it out.
Okay, very briefly, simplification and harmonization.
I'm going to say something that will make my energy colleagues happy. I think you as well. It's just integrated planning of infrastructure across factors.
Yes, we have it on our checklist as well, but I'm going to say something else, which is not to forget about research and innovation. Because when we talk about demand-side flexibility, there's going to be research needed how to operate with the technologies that we have in a completely different way.
Okay, thanks. Well, gosh, where to start? I'll start with the questions because those were in my head. on the labour and skills point, I'm glad it was raised because we do have a whole social dimension to this narrative, to the just transition narrative. And part of that is being very much aware of what's going to be in front of us. We are expecting change. The change can be nasty and disruptive, or we can be prepared for it. And obviously the latter is what we're trying to gear up for. Where there are changing skills, we flag that. There's lots of studies out there, you've probably written some, that talk about the different skills that are needed, the different training courses that are needed, the ways universities or vocational courses have to adapt to bring out to help retrain those in high carbon transition areas and regions, for instance. There are particular efforts and particular EU funds dedicated to helping that social transition occur. And there's the whole of DG Employment who also are fully seized of this dimension to their employment policies for Europe, and the European Social Fund. Again, there's 99 billion there in the current MFF that is meant to be helping on this dimension as well. So it is an important social dimension to the whole story, which must support in tandem the whole change. But I think with those tools and being able to anticipate and prepare, we may be as resilient as we can be to ensure. That's on the labour side. On the cross-subsidy, I'm going to link the cross-subsidy and cheap gas element simply because one possible upside of cheap gas prices is that it might make them easier to tax. We've noticed this in the history of taxation in the past, that it is easier to introduce a tax when the prices are low. So we've seen it in some member states in the past. That might be an upside from low gas prices, but in the short term, we're just happy with low gas prices. There's a political feeling we haven't fully recovered from the energy crisis and the shock. The narrative that we are still triple US prices is still a sensitive point from the president down. So the fact that we are trying to diversify or aggregate our demand, whatever the different instruments are that are out there to cheapen our short-term energy costs, that's important to us. But as the Draghi report makes clear, that ongoing need for competitiveness must be couched in a broader narrative of the decarbonisation that we're going through. And so there will be a change in relative prices. Partly there's the direct impact of ETS on this. There are other regulatory ways we can bring forward change if it's not being introduced through the gradual measures of relative prices. If you take what we do in eco-design, for instance, is ratcheting up improvements in energy efficiency of products in tandem with price signals. Ruling out internal combustion engines by 2035 is independent of price signals. So there's a way we can and we do use regulatory measures to complement if we are not satisfied that the price signals are driving things fast enough. So that's two aspects of the gas prices. And then in terms of the points you raised, I'm glad simplification came up because that's another point where I guess we're sort of open for examples. Simplification, I mean, apart from the Draghi comparison, which I'm not particularly fond of the 23,000 European regulations that changed compared to the 3 in the States, I'm not sure that that's a remotely relevant comparison myself, but I shouldn't say that in public. But the point remains that, yes, there is a broad sense that we have a lot of regulations, and that some of them are quite complex. In each case that this regulatory regime was created, it was done for good reasons, whether you're looking at the sustainability regime for bioenergy, or environmental regulations, or health and safety, or social and labor regulations. We do regulate because we have high expectations of the way our economies function across the board. Given that, if there are ways to simplify and still achieve our goals, and maybe the legislation or the implementation of the legislation evolved in an imperfect manner as it was implemented, then we want to hear about them. If there are ways to simplify and still achieve our goals, definitely we want to hear about these examples. And there will be an opportunity. I mean, we've talked broadly of the review we want to do of the overall governance of the energy regime. And so one way or the other, there will be ways, if it needs a legislative reform, there will be opportunities to take legislative action to simplify. But a lot of the time it will just be a regulatory or administrative change, which we would be happy to introduce. So yes, welcome on simplification. On integrated planning, it's another open door everyone's pushing at. Well, probably not everyone, because if everyone were pushing at it, we wouldn't need to do it. But it's clearly on our agenda too, every time we speak. And research and innovation, similarly, I mean, we've heard of some of the technologies. It's good that a lot of the technologies are available today, but we always know that the innovations need to come, whether it's in the technologies themselves or in the working methods or processes or materials to make that happen. There's always going to be a need for the innovation. So we have the EU research program, but again, that as bringing the innovation dimension into the policy is always necessary. And again, if there are ways you would like to see that done in the context of the Electrification Action Plan, we're happy to hear them.
Thank you so much. And yes, so I think that's you welcoming many to come with new ideas and concrete examples of what can be improved. Please join me in really thanking this panel for their wonderful contributions. My apologies for going a little bit over time. I will hand over to Emmeline for probably a relatively short last final thoughts just to close it out before networking lunch outside.
Thank you to our dear panelists. Thanks, Andreas, for excellent moderation, and thanks everyone for the questions. I won't try to do a summary, because I think what we heard today is that this transition is multifaceted when industries go at it, and that also the policy solutions that are needed are a wide array of solutions. Rebalancing taxation probably featuring very prominently, but a lot of also practical measures, and we learned, I think, that concrete cases on the ground have to inform the policy making. One thing is sure, I think this is a key moment for the transformation of the industry. We're really at the crossroads. The decade that comes will be key. We need to transform the industry for long-term competitiveness, and at the same time, we need to take care of the short-term competitiveness problems. Maybe the tools will convert at some point. Maybe at the beginning they need to be different, but we need to work on both dimensions in parallel. Thanks very much for this dialogue. There will be other opportunities to continue these very useful discussions. Thanks, everyone.